It was a Wednesday night. Jake, a single father, was out walking his dog, Max, as usual. The streets were quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. That's when everything changed. Max suddenly stopped in his tracks. His growl was low, but Jake knew it was serious. He followed the dog's gaze into the dark alley up ahead, where a figure lay in the shadows. At first, Jake thought it was just another drunk, but as he got closer, his heart sank. There was a woman, crumpled against the brick wall, her clothes soaked in blood. She looked up at him, eyes wide with fear, but she couldn't speak. Jake's first thought was to keep walking, to pretend he didn't see her, but he couldn't. Something in her expression stopped him cold. "Let me take you back to where it all began." Jake dropped to his knees beside her, the weight of the situation pressing on him in ways he didn't know how to handle. He wasn't a doctor, far from it. He was a mechanic. The only thing he was used to fixing were cars. But here he was, kneeling in the dark with a woman who was clearly on the edge of death. Blood poured from a wound in her side, staining her clothes and the pavement beneath her. Max stood by, his eyes trained on her as if he knew something Jake didn't. The woman's face was pale, her breathing shallow. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Help me." Jake's hands shook as he pressed them against the wound, trying to stop the blood. Her eyes fluttered, pleading for him to do something, anything. He had no idea what to do. His phone was dead. There was no one around, and he couldn't just leave her there. "Stay with me," Jake whispered, but his voice cracked. "Please stay with me." Her hand reached out, trembling, gripping his wrist. "Tell them, tell my team, I fought until the end," she whispered. That's when Jake realized this wasn't just any random woman. She wasn't some stranger in need of help. She was a medic, a soldier, and somehow she had ended up here on the cold, wet ground, dying. Jake didn't know what to think. He wasn't equipped to handle this, but he couldn't leave her. Not now. Not when she was still holding on to life by a thread. He didn't know who them were, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to keep her alive. He couldn't fail her. He pressed harder against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was no use. "Please," she whispered again, but her voice was fading. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the responsibility of keeping her alive. She couldn't die here, not in this alley, not like this, not on his watch. He heard something, a rustling sound behind him. His eyes shot up and he saw them. Two men stepped into the alley, their figures outlined in the dim light. They weren't here to help. They were here for her. Jake's pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of the situation. What was going on? Why were they after her? Max growled low and steady, standing between Jake and the men. The dog knew something wasn't right. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The men didn't seem afraid of Max. They moved closer, their footsteps deliberate, cold. "Move the dog," one of them said, his voice flat. Max didn't budge. Instead, the dog bared his teeth and growled even louder. Jake held his breath, his heart racing as he tried to keep his focus on the woman. He had to stop the bleeding. The men, however, weren't interested in playing games. One of them stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Jake. "Step aside," the man said. Jake's gaze flickered to the woman, then back to the men. "No," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "I'm not leaving her." He was caught between fear and instinct. He didn't know who these men were, but he couldn't back down. Max lunged, snapping at the closest man. The guy stumbled backward, clearly startled, and for a moment, Jake thought they might actually back off. But they didn't. They circled, their eyes never leaving Jake. Jake kept his hand pressed against the woman's side, his fingers slick with blood. "Stay away from her," Jake said, his voice low but strong. The men looked at each other. Then one of them stepped forward again. "She's not who you think she is." Jake didn't know what that meant, but he wasn't going to let them take her. Max kept growling, his body tense. "Move the dog. Now," the man ordered again. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What the hell was happening? The woman's breathing grew more ragged, and her grip on his wrist tightened. Tell them I tried," she said, her voice barely audible. Her hand went limp, and her body went cold. No. Jake's heart dropped as he checked her pulse, but it was gone. She was gone. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't lose her. Not after everything. Not after she'd held on just to tell him her final words. "Please," Jake begged, his voice raw. "Don't do this." He pressed harder, hoping for a miracle, but there was nothing. The weight of her death hit him like a punch to the stomach. Just as he was about to break down, he heard it, the sound of sirens, distant but approaching. Jake froze. His eyes went to the woman, then to the men who had circled them. His mind was racing, but he couldn't think straight. He had just watched her die in his arms. Was it too late? Would the sirens get here in time? Were these men still a threat? Jake looked down at the woman, his hands still on her, his heart racing. The sirens got closer. Would they make it in time to save anyone? The sirens grew louder, echoing through the alley as Jake's mind raced. His pulse was thudding in his ears, and his hands trembled where they still pressed against the woman's side. His eyes flicked from her face, now pale and lifeless, to the two men who were still watching him, their expressions unreadable. His breath caught in his throat. The police were getting closer. Would they be too late? He didn't know how much longer he could stay calm. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be in this situation. He was just a mechanic, a dad trying to do right by his daughter, a guy who had never thought he'd be tangled up in something like this. Yet here he was, holding the lifeless body of a woman whose last words were meant for someone else. He heard footsteps, and his head snapped up. A group of police officers rounded the corner, their flashlights sweeping the alley. Their uniforms were a stark contrast against the dim, cold light of the street lamps. One officer immediately shouted, "Back up! Give them space!" The others quickly moved into action, rushing over to the woman's body. Jake stood back, his legs shaky, feeling the weight of the entire moment press down on him. He had no words. He had no idea what to say. He just watched as they took over. They worked fast, their hands steady as they assessed her condition, their faces grim. A tall officer, his jaw tight, looked at Jake. His expression softened just slightly, but there was a clear disbelief in his eyes. "You did more than anyone could have expected," the officer said, his voice low. "You saved her life." Jake's mind was spinning. His breath was coming in shallow bursts as he looked down at his blood-stained hands, still gripping her vest, still hoping against hope. "I didn't save her," he said, shaking his head. "She's gone. She's gone." The officer stepped closer, his eyes searching Jake's. "No, you kept her alive long enough for us to get here. You did what none of us could have done." He gave a sharp nod toward the others. "We need to get her to the hospital now." The police moved in quickly, lifting her body with careful precision, and Jake took a step back. Max, still by his side, kept his gaze fixed on the officers, watching them as they took the woman away. Jake felt like he was in a daze, the events of the last few minutes moving in slow motion. His heart still pounded in his chest, but now, it felt like something else was pressing down on him. Guilt, confusion, and exhaustion all hit him at once. He wanted to ask the officers questions, wanted to know who she was, why she'd been there, what happened, but no words came out. "Hey!" The officer who had spoken to him earlier stepped up again. He was still looking at Jake, his eyes more curious than sympathetic. "You all right?" Jake nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. He looked down at Max, who was sitting by his side, still watching the scene unfold. Max's presence was the only thing that felt real right now. Everything else felt like a dream. One of the other officers walked over, a man in his early 30s with a serious look on his face. "You need to come with us," he said, motioning toward the police car parked nearby. "We'll need your statement. We've got some questions." Jake didn't argue. He walked toward the car, his body stiff, his mind running through the events like a movie that had been playing too fast. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, the pain in her eyes, the final plea she had made to him. Tell them. Tell my team I fought till the end. Who was she? What did she mean by that? As they reached the car, the officer who had spoken to him earlier turned to him again. You did good tonight, man, he said. You kept her alive. You did better than any of us would have. But we need to know what happened, how you ended up in that alley with her. Jake nodded mutely, sliding into the back of the squad car. The door shut with a soft thud, and he sank into the seat, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. The officer slid into the front seat and started the engine. The lights from the police vehicles flickered in the rearview mirror, casting eerie shadows across the alley. The air felt heavy with everything unsaid. Jake closed his eyes, trying to focus on something, anything. But all he could see were those last moments with the woman, her final words echoing in his head. Tell my team. Who was she? Why had she been in that alley? And why had she been so determined to survive, even when she knew the odds were against her? Jake's mind was racing, but no answers came. When they arrived at the station, Jake was led inside. It wasn't the first time he had been in a police station, but this was different. This wasn't about a speeding ticket or a report about something minor. He had just been involved in something he couldn't explain, something that felt bigger than anything he had ever faced. Inside, they sat him down in a small room, a clipboard in front of him, waiting for him to fill out a form. His hand hovered over the pen, but he couldn't bring himself to write anything down. His mind was still too clouded. The officer who had spoken to him earlier came back into the room, his face still serious but not unkind. Look, we don't know what's going on yet, but that woman, you said her name was Isabella? Jake blinked, unsure how to answer. He had no idea what her name was. He never asked. He had been too focused on keeping her alive, on doing whatever he could. But the name, Isabella, felt familiar, like he had heard it somewhere before. It was only a faint recollection, but it lingered. Yeah, Jake said slowly. I think that was her name. Isabella. The officer nodded. Isabella Carter. She's a combat medic. You've probably heard of her. She's been part of some big operations. She's been in the field for a while, but this, he trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Jake sat back, his mind reeling. A combat medic? What had she been doing in this small town? Why had she been here alone in the alley? And why had she trusted him of all people with her final words? Before Jake could ask any more questions, the door to the room opened again. A new officer stepped inside, a woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She looked at Jake, then at the officer who had been speaking to him. We've got some information. We need to move quickly, she said. Jake's stomach sank. He could feel something shifting, but he didn't know what. He wasn't prepared for what was coming, but he knew one thing. His life had already changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. He had no idea what he was getting into, but the quiet mechanic from Cedar Hollow had just stepped into something much bigger than himself. The room felt colder now, the hum of the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly as Jake followed the officers down the narrow hallway of the police station. The air smelled of stale coffee and something else, something metallic. His hands were still shaking, but he wasn't sure if it was from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins or the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He followed the woman officer into another room. This one was larger, and a large table sat in the center. Two other officers were already sitting, their expressions serious, their eyes scanning him like he was the key to something they didn't fully understand. Jake didn't know what to say. He felt like an outsider, caught up in something he wasn't supposed to be part of. The way they looked at him, like he was a hero or a witness to something bigger, only made him feel more out of place. He wasn't a hero. He was just a mechanic, a dad trying to get by, doing what needed to be done for his daughter. One of the officers, a man in his 40s with a weathered face, stood up when Jake entered the room. "Take a seat," he said, his voice calm but firm. Jake hesitated, but he nodded and sat down. The officers exchanged glances before the woman officer spoke again. "We need to ask you about what happened tonight. Everything you can remember." Jake nodded again, his throat dry. "I already told you what happened. I was just walking my dog, and I found her." She was already like that. Not everything, Jake, the man across from him said. You're not just a witness. You're part of the story now. And we need you to be clear about what you saw. He wasn't sure what the officer meant, but the word part hit him hard. Jake had always been a quiet, behind-the-scenes kind of guy. He wasn't someone who wanted to be in the middle of things, let alone at the center of a situation that involved people he didn't know and didn't understand. The woman officer set a file on the table, her eyes meeting his. Do you know what she said to you? Before she passed. Jake nodded slowly, remembering her final words. She said, "Tell them I fought until the end." The room grew quieter, the officers exchanging a look he couldn't read. The man in his 40s cleared his throat, as if to steady himself. Those aren't just words, Jake. They mean something. To us. To her team. Jake frowned. Who is she, really? What was she doing here? The woman officer folded her arms across her chest, her gaze steady. Her name was Isabella Carter, combat medic. She's been on special ops for the past several years. We've been tracking her team for a while now. They've been working undercover in some pretty dangerous territory. Jake blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. Undercover? Why? What for? We can't go into the specifics, the officer replied. But she's been a part of some very high-stakes operations. The kind of work that could make enemies very quickly. Jake's head spun. He had thought she was just a soldier, a medic, someone who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now it felt like there was more to the story. Isabella hadn't just been another victim. She had been someone important, someone who had lived a life full of danger, secrets, and unknown enemies. And you're telling me all this? Because she told me to, Jake said, more to himself than anyone in the room. But why me? Why would she want me to tell them? I don't even know who they are. The officer across from him leaned forward, his voice softer now. Jake, what you did tonight, it's more than just luck. You kept her alive long enough for us to get to her. That's something we can't ignore. But it's not just that. She trusted you with her final words for a reason. Jake's chest tightened. He hadn't thought about it like that. Why would she trust him? He was just a guy who walked his dog at night. Nothing special about him. Nothing to make him stand out from anyone else who could have stumbled into that alley. What's going to happen now? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers exchanged a look again before the man spoke. Now, we need your help. We need to know everything you can remember. Anything that stands out. Could make a difference. You're a part of this now, whether you want to be or not. Jake sat back, staring at the file in front of him. Isabella's last words replayed in his mind over and over. Tell them I fought until the end. Who was them? And what had she been doing here in this quiet little town? Before Jake could say anything more, the woman officer stood. We're going to need to gather more information, but you should go home. We'll contact you if we need anything else. Jake didn't argue. He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long, his thoughts racing. The officers were still talking, but their voices faded as he walked out of the room. He could still see the alley in his mind, the blood, the woman's lifeless body, the strange men who had appeared out of nowhere. He was in too deep now. He couldn't walk away. Something told him this wasn't over. Jake stepped outside into the night, the cool air hitting his face as he made his way to his truck. Max was already inside, sitting patiently, his eyes watching Jake intently. He slid into the driver's seat, his mind still spinning with questions. He was so caught up in the whirlwind of events that it was hard to focus on anything else. What had Isabella been involved in? Why had she trusted him with her last words? And who had been after her? As he drove home, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a message from Lily. Dad, I'm making dinner. You're going to be home soon, right? He smiled at the message, a brief moment of normalcy in the chaos that had become his life. He texted her back, I'll be home soon, kiddo. Don't start without me. But even as he typed the message, his mind was still on Isabella, on the blood, on the woman who had given her life to save others, and on the strange events that had led him to this point. Something wasn't right. He could feel it. Jake knew that his quiet, simple life had just been shattered, and there was no going back. He was already too far in. As he turned the corner into his neighborhood, Jake's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. His heart skipped a beat as he answered it. "Jake?" A voice on the other end asked. It was a woman's voice, sharp, no nonsense. "This is Captain Harris. I need to see you. Now." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what was coming next, but something told him it wasn't going to be good. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest. The moment he picked up the phone and heard Captain Harris's voice, he felt a chill run through him, deep into his bones. He didn't know what was happening, but everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. "Jake," Captain Harris repeated, her voice firm but not unkind. "Are you there?" He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the sudden rush of panic that gripped him. "Yeah, I'm here. I need to meet you," she said. "This isn't something I can explain over the phone. It's about Isabella. I know you're probably confused, but you've got to trust me on this. I'll be at the station in an hour. You'll understand everything then." Jake's stomach twisted. Trust her? How could he? He didn't know anything about her, about Isabella, or what had even happened tonight. But something about the urgency in her voice made him hesitate. He had no choice but to follow through. "I'll be there," he said quietly, his voice betraying the unease he was trying so hard to suppress. Captain Harris hung up without another word. Jake sat there for a moment, staring at his phone. The streetlights outside blurred in his vision, the weight of the night pressing on him. Max, who had been quietly lying in the back seat, shifted, his ears twitching. He seemed to sense the change in Jake's mood. "Let's go," Jake muttered to the dog, trying to steady his racing mind. He hadn't planned on returning to the station, hadn't planned on facing more questions, but now he had no choice. He wasn't about to leave Isabella's fate hanging in the air. He started the truck, the engine rumbling beneath him. Max's soft whine filled the silence, and for a brief moment, Jake wondered if his dog, too, felt the weight of the unknown. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly as Jake drove through the quiet streets, his thoughts on a loop, circling around the same haunting questions. What did Isabella mean by, "Tell them I fought till the end"? Who was she really, and why had she been so determined to make it to the end, even when she knew it might cost her life? He didn't have the answers, and the closer he got to the station, the more he realized that there was no going back now. This wasn't just a random act of kindness anymore. This was something far bigger. The woman he had tried to save, the woman who had died in his arms, wasn't just an innocent victim. She had a past that Jake had somehow become a part of. When Jake arrived at the station, he parked in the lot and sat there for a moment, taking a deep breath. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the image of Isabella's lifeless body, her last words echoing in his mind like a chant. "Tell them, I fought till the end." Max let out a soft bark from the back seat, as though urging Jake to snap out of his thoughts. With a heavy sigh, Jake opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air hitting him like a wake-up call. Inside the station, Captain Harris was waiting for him. She was standing near the entrance, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the room as if she were looking for something, or someone. Her uniform was crisp, her expression sharp. But when she saw Jake, her eyes softened just the slightest bit. "Jake," she greeted him, her voice steady, though there was an unmistakable urgency to it. "Thanks for coming. Let's go somewhere private." She led him down a long corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Max, always by Jake's side, walked at a steady pace beside him. When they reached an interrogation room at the back of the station, Captain Harris opened the door and motioned for him to enter. "Sit down. This won't take long." Jake stepped inside, his mind still spinning. He sat down, feeling the weight of the chair under him, the cold metal pressing against his legs. Max immediately laid down beside him, his head resting on Jake's foot, as though sensing his owner's tension. Captain Harris took a seat across from him, her hands folded on the table. She didn't speak for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch between them, giving Jake just enough time to wonder if he should say something first. But when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was no hiding the seriousness in it. Jake, what you don't know is that Isabella wasn't just any medic. She was one of the best in her field, and she was part of a special unit, one that works outside the law sometimes in the shadows. She had a reputation, a role in operations that put her in constant danger. But she also had a mission, something she was working on that goes far beyond what you saw tonight. Jake's heart thudded in his chest, the words hanging in the air, each one heavier than the last. A mission? What kind of mission? Captain Harris paused for a moment, her gaze never leaving him. It's classified, Jake. I can't give you all the details. But you need to understand that what you saw tonight wasn't a random act of violence. Someone or some group was trying to take her out. And you, she said, her tone softening slightly, you were right there in the middle of it. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. What do you mean? I was just walking my dog. I didn't do anything special. You did everything, Jake, Captain Harris interrupted. You kept her alive when no one else could. You gave us the time we needed to get to her. You didn't know it then, but you've now crossed paths with people who are very dangerous. People who were willing to do whatever it took to silence Isabella. Jake's stomach twisted. The words dangerous and silence rattled around his brain like a cold, hard truth he wasn't ready to face. His mind kept going back to her final words. Tell them I fought till the end. But it wasn't just a plea for him to pass along her message. It was something more, a warning, maybe, a cry for help, or a request for justice. So what now? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens to me? Captain Harris leaned forward, her eyes meeting his. That's what we need to figure out. You've been pulled into something bigger than you ever expected. But we're not leaving you in the dark, Jake. You'll be involved in this whether you like it or not. You may not realize it, but you're already a part of it. And if you want to stay safe, and if you want to help us find the people who did this, you need to trust us. You need to be in this fight with us. Jake's mind reeled, trying to process everything. 1 minute, he was just a guy walking his dog, trying to live a quiet life. The next minute, he was caught up in a web of danger, mystery, and people he didn't understand. And now he had a choice. Stick his head down and pretend none of this was happening, or stand up and face the truth. He looked at Max, who was now sitting up, his ears alert. The dog seemed to sense Jake's hesitation. It was as if Max knew that whatever happened next, they'd be in it together. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was coming, but something inside him told him that walking away wasn't an option. Not now. Not after everything. Okay, he said, his voice steady, though his insides were in turmoil. I'll help, but I need to know everything. No more secrets. Captain Harris nodded, her expression serious. You'll get the truth, Jake. I promise. And with those words, Jake realized his life would never be the same again. Just as Captain Harris stood to leave, the door to the room opened again. A young officer stepped in, his face pale, holding a phone to his ear. Captain, you need to see this. We've got a situation. The people we've been tracking. They just made a move. And it's bigger than we thought. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Whatever was coming next, it was about to get a whole lot more dangerous. The officer's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick with impending danger. Jake's pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck. What do you mean, they just made a move? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was afraid the walls might have ears. The young officer, still holding the phone, looked up at Captain Harris. She nodded at him, signaling him to speak. We got a tip, the officer said, his voice shaky but urgent. There's been a breach. Someone tried to access one of our secure locations. We don't know who exactly, but it's definitely connected to Isabella's team. Whoever they are, they're moving fast. We need to act now. Jake's head was spinning. He didn't understand any of this. None of it made sense. A secure location? Breach? What was going on? His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his body rigid with the pressure building inside him. "Who are these people?" Jake blurted out. "And what does any of this have to do with Isabella?" He needed answers. He needed to understand why, after everything that had happened, he couldn't just go home and forget about this mess. But the more the officers spoke, the more he realized he couldn't walk away. Not anymore. Captain Harris stood up, her face grave. "These people, whoever they are dangerous. Isabella was working on an operation that went south, and now they're trying to cover their tracks. We can't let them get away with it." She turned to the young officer. "Get the team together. We'll need to move out immediately." Jake watched as the officer scrambled to leave the room, and then Captain Harris turned her attention back to him. "You're in this, Jake," she said, "whether you want to be or not." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. "I know you didn't ask for this. I know you didn't want any part of this. But you're already too deep. You're connected to this now. Isabella trusted you with her last words, and that means something. You're part of the team now." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't feel like a part of anything. He felt like an outsider, a bystander who had stumbled into a mess far bigger than he ever could have imagined. But something inside him clicked. He wasn't just going to sit back and watch anymore. Not after everything he'd seen. Not after seeing Isabella's eyes, filled with desperation, her last words burning into his mind. "I'll help," Jake said finally, his voice steady. It wasn't a question, it was a decision. He didn't know what was ahead of him, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. It wasn't long before Jake found himself outside, waiting with a small group of officers near the station's back exit. The team was ready to move out, their faces grim, their weapons and gear in place. Max stood beside Jake, the dog sensing the tension, his ears alert. The rest of the team was silent, their attention fixed ahead, their focus razor-sharp. Captain Harris stepped forward. "We're heading to one of our safe houses. It's an old facility on the outskirts of town. Isolated, off the grid. We'll be safe there while we figure out who's behind this and what their next move is." Jake nodded. "I'm with you," he said, though part of him still wasn't sure what he was getting into. He wasn't part of their world, he wasn't trained for this kind of thing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had a responsibility now. A responsibility to Isabella, to the woman who had trusted him when no one else had. As they piled into the vehicles, the weight of the moment pressed in on Jake. The town he had known for so many years suddenly felt like a distant memory. He was about to plunge into something far darker, and the thought made his stomach churn. But there was no turning back. Not now. They drove for what felt like hours, the landscape around them shifting from the quiet familiarity of town to the barren, desolate outskirts. The tension in the air was thick. Jake could feel it in his bones. Whatever was happening, whatever Isabella had been caught up in, was real. It wasn't just some random attack. It was part of something larger. A battle he hadn't asked for, but one he was now a part of. Finally, the convoy pulled up to a gated facility, hidden behind high fences and overgrown trees. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but Jake could tell it was anything but. The security was tight. There were armed guards at every corner, watching every movement. "Stay close," Captain Harris instructed as they made their way inside. "We're not alone in here. Keep your head down, and don't talk unless we say." Jake felt his heart pounding in his chest as they moved through the facility's dark hallways. It smelled of dust, oil, and something old, like it had been forgotten by time. He looked at the officers around him, their faces hard, focused. This was their world. He was just an outsider. But the deeper they went into the facility, the more Jake realized how much danger they were all in. There were rooms with high-tech equipment, maps of places Jake couldn't even begin to understand, and photographs pinned to walls of faces he didn't recognize. These weren't just soldiers. These were people involved in something that went far beyond what he could see. They finally reached a secure room in the back of the facility. The door was sealed tight, and as Captain Harris unlocked it, she turned to Jake. "This is where it gets complicated," she said. "Everything we know, everything Isabella was working on, is inside. You might find things that don't make sense. It's going to be a lot to take in. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of it all. They were about to uncover a world he never knew existed. A world of danger, betrayal, and secrets buried deep beneath the surface. Inside the room, it was more like an operations center than anything else. There were computers, documents scattered across the table, and a massive map that covered one entire wall. A couple of officers were already at the computers, scrolling through files and pulling up data. They looked up as Captain Harris entered, nodding to her, but their eyes didn't linger on Jake. He wasn't part of their world yet. "Captain," one of the officers said, his voice tense, "we've got a situation. We've just confirmed the breach. Whoever's behind this, they've got intel on us. They're already inside our network. We can't afford to wait any longer." Jake's head snapped up. "What do you mean, inside our network?" The officer looked at him but didn't respond directly. Captain Harris, however, stepped forward. "It's worse than we thought. Whoever is after us, whoever Isabella was running from, has access to everything we've been working on. We're compromised. And now they're coming for us." Jake's mind was racing. Coming for us? He had no idea who they were, but the fact that they were now inside their system, inside their very walls, sent a chill through him. The danger was real. It was closing in. And the man who had attacked Isabella in the alley wasn't the last threat they would face. As the officers scrambled to secure everything and prepare for the next steps, Jake stood there, feeling like an outsider once again. Yet this time he couldn't turn away. He was in this now, for better or worse. There was no going back. Suddenly, the sound of a loud crash echoed through the building. The ground shook beneath them, and the lights flickered. Captain Harris's face turned pale as she rushed to the door. "They're here," she said under her breath. "They've found us." Jake's heart skipped a beat as the room filled with chaos. The storm they had all been waiting for had finally arrived. And he was right in the middle of it. The sound of the crash reverberated through the walls, its impact like a thunderclap that shook the very foundation of the building. Jake's heart raced, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The officers around him moved with practiced speed, their faces hardening into expressions of grim determination. Captain Harris didn't hesitate. She was already moving, her voice sharp as she barked orders at her team. "Lock down the perimeter. Get those doors secured, now." Jake stood frozen for a second, his mind reeling. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a random attack. This was real. Whoever they were, the people coming for them were organized, and they had no intention of backing off. "Jake!" Captain Harris's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing by the door, a look of urgency in her eyes. "Get in here. We need to move fast." Without thinking, Jake followed her, his feet pounding against the floor as he reached the inner room. The officers were already securing all exits, checking the monitors, and communicating over their radios. The air in the room felt thick with tension, and Jake had never felt more out of place in his life. This wasn't his world. It was dangerous, it was fast, and it was closing in on them. "What's happening?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse, his mind struggling to keep up. "They've breached the facility," Captain Harris explained, moving to a large monitor mounted on the wall. She typed rapidly on the keyboard, pulling up surveillance footage from different cameras throughout the compound. "Whoever is after us, they're already inside. We need to move now. We don't have much time." Jake's eyes scanned the screen. He could see movement in the dark hallways, silhouettes of people moving swiftly, efficiently. They were well-trained, whatever they were. He felt a chill settle deep in his chest. This was no longer just about a random attack on Isabella. This was coordinated, and it was coming for them. "Do we know who they are?" Jake asked, his voice trembling slightly as he watched the footage. Captain Harris shook her head. "Not yet, but whoever they are, they're well-funded, and they have resources we haven't seen before. We've been keeping tabs on some of their movements, but they've been operating in the shadows for a long time." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. This was real. Too real. He had thought helping Isabella would be a one-time thing, a small act of kindness. But now, the gravity of what he was involved in hit him like a ton of bricks. Captain Harris looked at Jake, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. Listen, Jake, you've already been pulled into this. But you need to understand something. Whatever happens next, you need to stay focused. Don't panic. If you want to help, you have to be all in. Jake swallowed hard, nodding slowly. What choice did he have? He was already too deep. His thoughts kept returning to Isabella, her final words echoing in his mind. She had trusted him, and now he had to trust her. We'll move out in groups, Captain Harris continued. Jake, you're with me. We'll clear the back rooms. Make sure no one gets through. Keep your head down, and whatever happens, don't engage unless I tell you. Jake nodded again, his breath coming faster now. He wasn't trained for any of this. He was just a mechanic. But here he was, standing in a high-stakes operation trying to figure out how to survive. The facility was eerily quiet as they moved through the narrow hallways. The walls were lined with old equipment, dusty and unused, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every step felt heavier than the last, every corner a potential threat. Max, Jake's loyal dog, was walking silently by his side, his ears alert, nose twitching. The dog seemed to sense the danger as much as Jake did, his eyes scanning every dark corner, every shadow. As they moved deeper into the compound, Jake's thoughts drifted back to Isabella, the woman who had died in his arms, the woman who had asked him to pass along her final message. What had she been a part of? What had she been running from? And more importantly, why had she trusted him with her last words? He couldn't help but feel like he was being led through a maze, one with no clear way out. He kept reminding himself that he was doing the right thing, that by helping, he was honoring her memory. But the weight of it was overwhelming. Every decision he made, every step he took now felt like it had irreversible consequences. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and Captain Harris signaled for Jake to stay back. She motioned to the other officers, who positioned themselves at the edges of the room, waiting for the signal. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as Captain Harris unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, but the faint glow of the monitors lit up the space just enough for them to move cautiously. Captain Harris held up her hand, signaling for silence. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he heard the faint sound of footsteps. "Stay here," she whispered, her eyes hardening. She stepped forward, gun raised, as the rest of the team followed her inside. Jake's body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the small weapon he'd been given, though he had no experience using it. He wasn't ready for a fight, but the adrenaline coursing through him left him with little choice. They moved quickly through the room, clearing corners and checking for any signs of intruders. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears, but his focus remained sharp. His thoughts were still on Isabella, on her words, her message. Whoever was behind this had to be stopped. But would they be able to do it in time? Were they already too late? As they reached the center of the room, Jake's eyes fell on a set of papers spread out on the table. A few of the officers were already going through them, but Captain Harris took a step forward, her gaze narrowing. "This is it," she said under her breath. "We've been looking for this. We finally have a lead." Jake stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. He could see that the papers were marked with different names, locations, and dates. Some of them were written in code, military-style codes that Jake didn't understand. But one thing was clear. This was the information they had been desperately trying to uncover. This was what Isabella had been working on. "We need to get this back to the main operation room," Captain Harris said. "Now." As she moved toward the door, the ground suddenly trembled beneath them, the walls shaking with the force of something loud, something powerful. It happened so quickly. A loud crash echoed through the facility, followed by the sound of gunfire from somewhere deeper in the compound. "They're here," Captain Harris hissed. "Get to the safe room now." Jake barely had time to react before a blinding light filled the hallway. The sound of rushing footsteps grew louder, and Jake's blood ran cold. Whoever was coming, they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to finish what they had started. "Go!" Captain Harris shouted, and with that, the team rushed forward, weapons raised, ready for whatever came next. Jake had no idea if they were going to make it out alive. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the man he had been before. He was deep in it now, and there was no turning back. Jake's mind was racing, every instinct screaming at him to get out, to run. But he couldn't. He had been dragged into this mess. And now there was no way out. The chaos unfolding around him felt like something out of a nightmare. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hallways, rattling the walls, and the air seemed charged with a kind of raw, terrifying energy. Whatever was happening in this building, it was bigger than he ever imagined. Captain Harris's voice was urgent as she moved swiftly, gesturing for Jake to follow. "Stick close," she ordered, her eyes scanning the hallway with sharp focus. She led the group down the darkened corridor, her hand on her weapon as she moved with purpose. The officers behind her followed closely, weapons raised, ready for anything. Max, ever loyal, stayed at Jake's side. His ears perked, his body tense, as if sensing the danger. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't ignore the one thing that kept tugging at his mind. Isabella. She was gone, but her words, the promise she made, the responsibility she entrusted to him, were heavy on his heart. He couldn't back out now. He couldn't let her death be in vain. He had to see this through, no matter the cost. They rounded a corner, and the sound of footsteps grew louder. The officers in front of him immediately flattened against the wall, their eyes scanning the darkness. Jake followed suit, his body rigid with tension. He had no idea what to expect next. "Stay here," Captain Harris whispered, her eyes narrowing. She motioned to the officers behind her. "We need to clear this next room before we move forward." Jake nodded, trying to steady his breath as he crouched down behind the wall, his heart racing. The silence in the hallway was deafening, punctuated only by the distant thrum of footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. The weight of the situation was closing in on him. He wasn't trained for this. He wasn't a soldier. But he was here now, and there was no going back. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open broke the silence. Jake's body tensed, and Max growled low in his throat. Captain Harris raised her hand, signaling everyone to be still. For a moment, everything was frozen in time. Then, like a ripple through the air, the door to the next room burst open, and a team of armed men flooded into the hallway. Jake barely had time to react. The officers sprang into action, immediately returning fire as the attackers opened fire on them. The chaos erupted in a violent clash of noise and movement. Jake's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Max by the collar, pulling him close as gunshots rang out around them. "Move!" Captain Harris shouted, her voice sharp as she ducked into the room, her weapon trained on the enemy. Jake hesitated, watching as the officers moved quickly into the room, securing positions. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but the world around him seemed to blur. He had no military training, no experience with combat. The fear surged through him, but he kept his focus. He couldn't freeze up now. He sprinted after the team, his breath shallow, his chest tight with anxiety. As he ducked into the room with the others, he found himself in a small, dimly lit space. It was a conference room of sorts, filled with scattered papers, maps, and documents that seemed unimportant in the face of the firefight. But Jake knew that these papers were part of it all, part of what Isabella had been trying to stop. "Stay down," Captain Harris barked, pulling Jake behind a large desk. Max was beside him, his body low to the ground, as if he knew the danger was only beginning. Jake could feel the heat of the gunfire, the tension of the officers as they moved, their every step calculated and purposeful. The room was a battlefield now. He watched as one of the officers, a young woman with short-cropped hair, moved with precision, her gun steady as she cleared the doorway. "Stay with me," Captain Harris ordered Jake, her voice firm and urgent. "We need to get to the control room. That's where they're keeping the rest of the intel. It's our only shot at stopping this." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words, his mind still spinning. The control room. He had no idea what they were going to find there, but he couldn't hesitate. Not now. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway grew louder. The attackers were closing in, but Captain Harris wasn't about to let them have the upper hand. She motioned for the team to move. "Go!" she shouted. They moved quickly, ducking through doors, clearing rooms, staying low to avoid the hail of gunfire that had begun to fill the hallways. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. Max, ever the protector, stayed close by his side, his body taut with anticipation. They finally reached the control room, a narrow door at the end of the hallway. Captain Harris checked her weapon one last time before turning to Jake. "Ready?" Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yeah, let's do it." She kicked the door open, and the team flooded into the room. The space was filled with computers, monitors, and rows of high-tech equipment. It was like a war room, and Jake felt out of place, out of his depth. But he was here now, and he wasn't leaving until they got the answers they needed. Captain Harris moved swiftly to one of the monitors, her fingers flying across the keys. "We're running out of time," she muttered under her breath. "They're pulling the plug on the system. If we don't find the files before they wipe everything, we're dead in the water." Jake's stomach twisted. Wipe everything? What did she mean? How much was on these systems? How much had Isabella been trying to uncover? A loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door being forced open. The attackers were closing in on them. Captain Harris's eyes flicked to the door, then to the monitor. 5 minutes, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We either get what we need in 5 minutes or we don't." Jake felt the clock ticking down. There was no turning back now. Just as Captain Harris began to type furiously at the computer, the lights flickered, and then everything went dark. The room plunged into total darkness. The air around them felt suddenly thick, as if time itself had stopped. "Captain!" Jake's voice shook as he reached out for her in the blackness. "What happened?" "We're out of time," she said quietly. "They're here." A single gunshot echoed from the hallway, followed by a loud crash. The door to the control room slammed open, and the sound of boots on the floor filled the room. Jake's breath caught in his chest. Whoever was coming, they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to finish it. The room was plunged into darkness. The only sound was Jake's heart pounding in his chest, the eerie silence pressing in around him. Max, ever alert, was sitting rigidly at Jake's side, his ears trained on the noise outside the control room. Jake felt the tension coil in his gut as he fumbled for his flashlight. He flicked it on, but the beam of light seemed too weak to pierce the thick darkness surrounding them. "We've lost power," Captain Harris said, her voice low and strained. "They've cut the grid." Jake could hear the panic in her voice, but there was no time for hesitation. The seconds stretched, each one feeling like a minute, each heartbeat thundering in his ears. He gripped the flashlight tighter, shining it around the room, but all he could see were the outlines of monitors and equipment. "We need to move," Captain Harris ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Now." Jake felt the weight of her words. The attackers were closing in. He wasn't sure how many of them were out there or what they wanted, but the urgency in Captain Harris's voice told him everything he needed to know. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't afford to be trapped in the dark. They had to find a way out. As the team began to move, the door to the control room burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the floor. The team immediately snapped into action, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness. "Get ready," Captain Harris said, her voice sharp. She moved quickly to the door, signaling the team to follow her. Jake stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling. What was happening? Why had everything gone dark? What was so important about this building? Then it hit him. Isabella, the woman who had trusted him, the woman who had given him her final words. She had been part of something huge, something that Jake had no idea about, but he was now tangled in it. She had asked him to tell her team that she had fought until the end. And now Jake was fighting for her, fighting for something that went beyond just surviving. He was fighting for justice, for the truth. Captain Harris motioned for Jake to follow. "Stay close," she said, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "We can't stay here. They'll be after us." Jake nodded, his breath shaky, but his resolve solid. He couldn't let this be the end. Not now. He wasn't going to let Isabella's sacrifice be in vain. They moved through the building in silence, the tension thick in the air. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. They had to stay one step ahead. They had to find the answers. The attackers weren't just after them, they were after something much bigger. "Move, move, move," Captain Harris barked as they reached a narrow hallway. She quickly checked her corners, her weapon raised, eyes darting from side to side. Jake's heart raced as he followed her, staying as close to her as he could. Max was at his side, keeping pace, his body tense. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The walls shook with the force of the blast, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. They were coming. The attackers were closing in fast. "Go!" Captain Harris shouted, her voice filled with urgency. She sprinted ahead, her team following her as they moved down the hallway. Jake's legs were heavy, his mind running through everything that had happened. Isabella's last words, the breach in the facility, the mysterious men. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected, that they were all playing into someone else's hands. They reached a set of stairs, the dim emergency lights flickering overhead. Captain Harris moved swiftly up the steps, her gun trained ahead of her. Jake followed, his breath coming in short bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, but he didn't dare look back. They reached the top of the stairs and entered a small, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with old photographs and maps, but there was no time to focus on anything but the task at hand. Captain Harris turned to Jake, her expression hard. "This is it. The next door leads to the roof. We need to get out of here before they lock us in." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the hallway. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded. This wasn't just an attack on them. It was an attack on everything Isabella had been working for. Whoever these people were, they were trying to erase everything. Captain Harris reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling as she turned it. But before she could open it, the sound of gunfire rang out, followed by a shout. Captain Harris flung the door open, and they spilled out onto the rooftop, the cold wind hitting them like a slap in the face. The sound of helicopters filled the sky. It was so loud, Jake had to cover his ears. He glanced up and saw dark shapes moving through the night sky. Military helicopters, the kind he'd only seen in movies. "Get down!" Captain Harris shouted, pulling him down to the ground. The team quickly took cover behind a large air conditioning unit, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning the sky. Jake's mind was racing. He had no idea what was going on, but one thing was clear. They were in the middle of something huge, something that was out of their control. The attackers were here, and the helicopters above only confirmed that this wasn't some random assault. This was a military-grade operation, and they were right in the middle of it. "We need to get out of here," Captain Harris said, her voice low but filled with determination. "We can't stay on this rooftop. They'll have us cornered in minutes." Jake looked around, his mind spinning. There had to be another way. There had to be something they could do. As if in answer, he heard a noise, a faint humming sound from the distance. It was the sound of an engine, a vehicle, coming closer. "Hold tight," Captain Harris said, her eyes narrowing. "We've got one shot. We take it or we're done for." Before Jake could respond, he saw it. A jeep, speeding toward the edge of the building. It was coming straight at them. "What the hell is that?" Jake muttered, his mind struggling to catch up. Captain Harris didn't hesitate. She waved her hand to signal the team. "Move now." They ran toward the jeep, their feet pounding against the rooftop, the sound of gunfire now distant behind them. Max was at Jake's side, his ears alert, as the jeep pulled up just in time. "Get in!" one of the officers yelled as the door flew open. "Now!" Without a second thought, Jake dove into the back seat, Max following him. The Jeep sped off the rooftop with a jolt, and they were off. The sound of the helicopter's engines still rumbled in the distance, but they were getting farther away, their pursuit fading into the night. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but as the Jeep raced through the streets, he realized one thing. They had made it out. For now. But the fight was far from over. As the Jeep sped down the empty road, Captain Harris's voice broke through the silence. "We've got one more stop. The real fight's just begun." Jake swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" She turned to him, her eyes burning with intensity. "Isabella didn't just leave us a message. She left us a trail, and it's up to us to follow it." The Jeep bounced along the road, the engine roaring as they sped through the streets, leaving the chaos of the compound behind them. Jake's heart was still pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't understand how his quiet life had been torn apart in the span of a few hours. One minute he was walking his dog, and the next he was running for his life, dragged into something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Captain Harris's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The real fight's just begun. What did she mean? They had barely escaped the compound. They were in the back seat of a Jeep with the sound of helicopters still echoing in the distance. And yet, the real fight was still ahead of them. The officers in the Jeep sat tense, their eyes scanning the road ahead, every sense on high alert. Jake felt Max's head pressed against his lap, the dog's quiet whine a reminder of the surrealness of it all. Max had always been a comfort, a steady presence in Jake's life. But now, even the dog seemed to sense the danger that surrounded them. Captain Harris, sitting in the front seat, turned to Jake. Her expression was grim, her jaw clenched with determination. "We're not safe yet. Whoever was behind the attack. They'll be coming after us, and they won't stop until they get what they want. But you've got to understand, Jake. This is bigger than just a fight for survival." Jake's throat tightened. "What do you mean? What's going on? Why were they after Isabella? Why are we involved in this?" Captain Harris glanced at him briefly, her eyes narrowing. "It's a long story, but I'll give you the short version. Isabella was part of a special unit, elite combat medics who were trained for more than just battlefield medicine. They were involved in covert operations, working in the shadows to stop dangerous organizations. The intel she had was critical. It wasn't just medical information. It was a key piece of something far more dangerous." Jake felt his stomach churn. Covert operations. Dangerous organizations. The words sent a shiver down his spine. He thought he was helping someone in distress, someone who had just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now it seemed like Isabella had been part of something far bigger. A web of lies, secrets, and danger that Jake had only just begun to untangle. "Do you know what this operation was?" Jake asked, his voice strained. He needed answers, needed to understand what Isabella had been a part of. "I wish I could tell you everything," Captain Harris said, her voice low. "But right now, we need to stay focused on the task at hand. We're not in the clear yet. We don't know how many people are involved in this or how deep the operation goes." Jake's thoughts were spinning. He couldn't comprehend it all. It was too much. But what he did know was this. Isabella's final words had entrusted him with a piece of a puzzle, a trail that he now had to follow, whether he was ready or not. As the Jeep sped down the road, Jake could see the city's outskirts in the distance. They were leaving the lights behind, venturing into the unknown. The road was empty, deserted, with nothing but the occasional streetlight to break the darkness. The silence in the Jeep was heavy, thick with the tension of what lay ahead. The team's leader, one of the officers who had been with them in the compound, spoke up from the front seat. "We've got a safe house up ahead. It's an old warehouse on the edge of town. We'll regroup there and lay low for a while." Jake nodded, though his mind was still spinning. A safe house? A warehouse? They were running from something, but where exactly were they going? What was next? "Stay sharp," Captain Harris said, her voice steady but urgent. "We've made it out for now, but this isn't over. The people after us are powerful. They've got resources we can't even imagine. And they'll stop at nothing to finish what they started." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. His hand instinctively reached for Max, the dog's steady presence grounding him for a brief moment. But that wasn't enough. He needed answers, not just more questions. They reached the warehouse soon after, the building looming in the distance, surrounded by overgrown trees and abandoned structures. The quiet was unnerving. Jake could barely see anything beyond the headlights of the Jeep, but as they pulled up to the building, the headlights revealed a set of old, rusted gates, and the faint outline of the warehouse itself. The Jeep came to a stop, and Captain Harris got out first, motioning for Jake and the others to follow. "Get in. We need to keep a low profile." They all exited the Jeep, and Jake followed the team into the warehouse. The interior was dark, the only light coming from small lamps set up in corners of the building. The scent of dust and stale air filled his nostrils as they walked further inside. There were shelves full of crates and boxes, equipment scattered across the floor. Felt like an old, forgotten place. Captain Harris moved quickly, scanning the room. "We'll be safe here for now," she said, her voice low. "But this place won't hold up forever. We need to get the intel Isabella left behind. It's the only way to stop them." Jake looked around at the others, their faces tense, their eyes filled with determination. The room felt heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the danger, one thing was certain. They had made it here together, and they were going to figure this out. Captain Harris turned to Jake, her expression hard. "We don't have much time. The attack tonight was just the beginning. There's a network of people behind this, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure their secrets stay buried." Jake nodded, his heart thudding in his chest. His role in all of this had only just begun. But one thing was clear. He was in this fight now, whether he was ready or not. As they began to settle in, a sudden noise interrupted the quiet. A soft clicking sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make everyone freeze. Captain Harris's eyes locked onto Jake, her voice a sharp whisper. "They've found us." Before Jake could react, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and shadowed figures slipped inside, weapons drawn. It was happening again. The door creaked open, and Jake's heart seemed to stop beating. The shadowed figures moved with purpose, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light of the warehouse. His breath caught in his throat as he instinctively reached for Max, who growled low and steady at his side. The dog's hackles were raised, every muscle tense. He could feel it. Danger was closing in on them. Captain Harris's hand shot up, signaling for everyone to hold still. Her eyes darted to the others in the room, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay low. Stay quiet." Jake's pulse raced, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Who were these people? And how had they found them so quickly? From the shadows, a low voice called out, "We know you're in here. Don't try to run." The voice was cold, controlled, like it belonged to someone who had been in this kind of situation 100 times before. The words sent a chill down Jake's spine. Captain Harris's jaw tightened. She nodded slightly to the team, and they all took up positions, their weapons raised, their bodies ready for whatever came next. But Jake didn't move. He was frozen in place, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't a soldier. All he could do was trust the people around him, hope that they could keep him safe. Max, sensing the tension, kept his growl low, a constant reminder that they weren't alone. Jake reached down and patted the dog's head, trying to steady himself. The figures moved closer, their footsteps steady, deliberate. Jake couldn't see their faces, but he could feel their presence like a storm building up in the distance. They were closing in on them. "We know you've got something," the voice continued, louder now, more confident. "You've got the intel, and we want it. Hand it over, and we won't have to make this messy." Captain Harris moved quickly, signaling for Jake and the others to stay hidden. She stepped to the side, keeping her body low, eyes narrowed. She didn't speak, but Jake could see the tension in her posture. She was ready to move at a moment's notice. Jake's mind raced. Intel? Was that what this was all about? Were they after the files Isabella had been trying to protect? Had she known this would happen? Before he could piece it all together, the figures emerged from the shadows, their bodies finally illuminated by the faint glow of the emergency lights. They were armed, their weapons aimed in every direction, scanning for any movement. They looked like professionals, soldiers, or mercenaries, and their expressions were cold, devoid of any empathy. One of the men, taller than the others, stepped forward. His face was obscured by a mask, but Jake could see the coldness in his eyes. "I'm not asking again," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Where is it?" Captain Harris didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her weapon still trained on the man, but she said nothing. There was a calmness about her that Jake envied. She was used to this kind of danger. She had been here before. But Jake? He was new to all of this. He didn't know how to react, how to defend himself. He wasn't trained for this. All he had was his will to survive and the promise he had made to Isabella. As the tension thickened, Jake felt a sharp pang of guilt. He hadn't done enough to protect her. She was dead because he couldn't save her. Now, all he could do was make sure her sacrifice meant something. He wasn't going to let them take the intel. He couldn't. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the warehouse. Another figure appeared, this one moving more cautiously, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the situation. He looked familiar to Jake, though he couldn't place where he had seen him before. The newcomer raised his hand. "Stand down," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "We're not here to kill anyone." Captain Harris didn't lower her weapon. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. The man stepped into the light, revealing a face that was both strange and familiar. He was in his mid-30s, with short brown hair and sharp features. His eyes locked with Jake's, and something in them seemed to recognize him. "Jake," the man said softly, his voice laced with recognition. "It's me. You don't remember me, do you?" Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea who this was, but there was something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes lingered on him, that made Jake's skin crawl. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. He didn't know what else to say. This man had clearly recognized him, but Jake had no recollection of him. Who was he? The man's face softened slightly. "It's been a long time, Jake. But I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." Jake's mind was spinning. He had no idea what was going on. But now everything seemed even more complicated. They weren't just running from mercenaries. They were running from a mystery that was much deeper than he had thought. Captain Harris stepped forward, her eyes hard. "If you're here to help, you better start explaining. Fast." The man nodded, his gaze flickering toward the others in the room. "I know who's behind this, and I know why they're after you." Isabella wasn't just some random soldier. She was part of a covert operation to bring down one of the most dangerous organizations in the world. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What organization? Who are they?" The man's face hardened as he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They're not just criminals. They're a shadow organization operating under the radar for years." And Isabella was close to uncovering everything. If she had survived. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Isabella had known too much, and now they were all caught in a web that was spinning out of control. Jake swallowed hard, the weight of the situation hitting him all at once. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined, and somehow he had become part of it. A part of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything he had known. The man took a step back, his eyes flickering between Jake and the others. "We have to move. Now, the people after you, they'll be here soon. And when they come, they won't stop until they get what they want." Jake nodded slowly, his mind racing. There was no more time to waste. The truth was out there, and they had to find it before it was too late. As the team prepared to move, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. It was the unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles. Heavy, fast, and closing in. Captain Harris's expression darkened. "They're here," she said, her voice cold. "We have one chance to make it out alive." Jake's pulse quickened. This was it. The final confrontation was coming. and there was no going back. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tension in the warehouse like a blade. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stood with the others, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. His mind was racing, but all he could focus on was the sound of the sirens. They were closing in, whoever they were, whatever they wanted. "We need to move now," Captain Harris barked, her voice filled with urgency. She wasn't waiting for anyone to hesitate. She grabbed Jake's arm and yanked him toward the back exit of the warehouse. Max was already at Jake's side, his paws tapping urgently against the concrete floor. The officers scrambled to move out, their weapons raised, their focus laser-sharp. Jake tried to keep up, but his legs felt heavy, his thoughts still spinning from everything that had happened so far. He had never imagined his life would come to this. He was just a mechanic, a single father, trying to keep a roof over his daughter's head. Now, he was in the middle of a high-stakes operation with men and women who had dedicated their lives to something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The man who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had called him by name, was already ahead, signaling for the others to follow. "This way," he urged, moving quickly down a narrow corridor that led to the rear of the warehouse. Captain Harris pushed Jake forward, her expression fierce. "We don't have much time. They're getting closer. Get to the van. We'll regroup there." Jake nodded, his breath coming in short bursts as he followed. His mind was still racing. Isabella's last words, the mystery behind her operation, and the people after them. It was all too much to process, but there was no time to think. They reached the back door of the warehouse, and Captain Harris pulled it open. The night air hit them like a cold slap, the sound of tires screeching in the distance sending a wave of panic through Jake's chest. They were almost there. Then, from the corner of his eye, Jake saw movement. A flash of light. The unmistakable shape of a black SUV pulling up quickly toward the warehouse. "They're here," Captain Harris hissed, her voice low but deadly serious. Without a second thought, she shoved Jake toward the waiting van, motioning for the others to follow. "Go! Now!" she shouted. Jake scrambled into the van, his heart racing as the door slammed shut behind him. Max jumped in beside him, his tail low, his body tense with the same unease Jake was feeling. The van's engine roared to life, and they sped off down the darkened street, leaving the warehouse and whatever was waiting behind them in the dust. The vehicle bounced along the uneven road, the headlights cutting through the night as they made their way through the quiet streets. Jake glanced out the window, his mind still spinning with questions. Who were these people chasing them? Why were they after Isabella's team? And why had they involved him? "Keep your head down," Captain Harris ordered, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror. "We're not safe yet." Jake nodded, his stomach a tight knot of nerves. There was no sense in asking questions now. They were too far in. The danger was real, and it was only a matter of time before the people chasing them caught up. The van took a sharp turn, and Jake was jolted against the seat. He looked up at the officer in the front seat, who glanced back at him. "You doing okay?" the officer asked, his voice rough. Jake didn't answer immediately. He was still processing everything. It was all too much, too fast. One minute he was just trying to help someone, and the next he was running for his life. He had no idea how to handle it, but something inside him had changed. Isabella had trusted him, and now he had a responsibility to finish what she had started. "I'll be fine," Jake said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. Captain Harris spoke again, her voice low but serious. "We're going to need a plan. They know we're out here and they're closing in. We have to find the intel. The files Isabella had. They're our only leverage now." Jake's mind raced. The files. They were talking about the very thing that had led him into all of this. Isabella's mission, the operation that had gone wrong. The pieces of a puzzle that were still scattered in the dark. And now they were after him because of it. "We don't know who's pulling the strings, but we know they're powerful," Captain Harris continued, her gaze sharp as she looked ahead. "And we know that Isabella's team, her team, Jake, was working to stop something big, something dangerous." The van sped on, the night air pressing in through the cracked windows. Jake's thoughts kept returning to Isabella. The woman who had fought until the end. The woman whose final words had become his burden, his mission. He wasn't going to let her sacrifice be for nothing. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Harris didn't look at him, but she answered anyway. "There's a safe house about an hour from here. We'll regroup, figure out what to do next. But we have to get the files. They're the key to everything." Jake nodded again, his mind still spinning. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever came next. But he knew one thing: he wasn't backing down. The van finally pulled into a secluded area, a small property tucked away on the outskirts of town. It was surrounded by trees and high fences, hidden from view. The van came to a stop in front of a small building that looked like an old cabin, its windows dark and uninviting. Captain Harris didn't waste any time. She was out of the van before Jake could even unbuckle his seatbelt. The team quickly followed, moving with practiced precision as they approached the cabin. "This is the safe house," Captain Harris said as she led the way inside. "We'll lay low here for now." The cabin was small but well-equipped, with everything they needed to stay off the radar. Jake didn't know what to expect, but he followed Captain Harris inside. Max stayed close by his side, his eyes scanning the room, ever alert. Inside, the team quickly got to work. Officers set up a perimeter outside, while others checked the equipment. Captain Harris moved to a desk in the corner, pulling out a set of documents and a laptop. She worked quickly, her fingers flying over the keys as she pulled up files, trying to make sense of the chaos. Jake stood by the door, his mind still spinning. He wanted answers, but he knew now wasn't the time for questions. They had to focus. They had to find the files. Everything depended on it. Suddenly, a loud noise rang out from the front of the cabin. A crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Jake's body tensed, his heart pounding in his chest. "Get down!" Captain Harris shouted as she grabbed Jake and pulled him toward cover. The front door burst open, and the sound of boots hitting the floor echoed in the small cabin. "Get ready," Captain Harris said, her voice tight with resolve. "They've found us." The room was thick with tension, the sound of heavy breathing filling the space as Jake's mind raced. The man standing before them, the one who had approached him earlier, wasn't here to help. His eyes locked onto Jake's, cold and calculating, like he had been planning this all along. There was no confusion now. This wasn't just a random attack. This was all part of a much larger game. Captain Harris's face twisted with recognition. "You," she whispered, her voice betraying a mix of anger and disbelief. "You sold us out." The man's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. "I didn't sell anyone out. I'm just playing my part. You're all just pawns in a bigger game. And now you've made it to the final round." Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were surrounded. There was no way out. He glanced at Captain Harris, the determined look on her face telling him everything he needed to know. They were in this together now. "I won't let you do this," Captain Harris said, her voice steady but full of fury. "You don't have a choice," the man replied, his tone icy. "The operation is already in motion. You're all irrelevant now." Jake didn't understand everything that was happening. All he knew was that the man standing before them was part of something much bigger, something darker, something that had taken Isabella's life and was now threatening everyone else around them. Why? Jake finally found his voice. Why was Isabella involved in this? What was she trying to stop? The man's smile faded, and his eyes hardened. "You really don't understand, do you? Isabella was working for a cause, yes, but she didn't understand the full scope. She was trying to stop the inevitable. This operation, the one she was part of, was meant to reshape everything. Power, control, information, all of it." Jake's mind swirled. Power, control. He couldn't wrap his head around it. The files. Isabella's sacrifice. It was all connected. But to what? "I don't care what you've been promised," Captain Harris said, stepping forward, her weapon still trained on the man. "This ends tonight. You won't get away with it." The man chuckled, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You think you're in control? You're already too late. The information Isabella had, the files you've been running after, they're already gone. The people I work for, they've already won. A surge of panic washed over Jake. What do you mean they're gone? Where are they? The man gave a short laugh. I'm afraid that's not for you to know. You're not the one who gets to decide how this ends. Before Jake could react, the door to the room behind them slammed open with a sudden force, and a dozen armed figures flooded the space. The attackers had made their move. Captain Harris spun around, quickly positioning herself between Jake and the new threat. The rest of the team scrambled to react, but there were too many armed enemies. The room felt like it was closing in on them. Get ready, Captain Harris shouted, her voice full of command. We're not done yet. We fight or we die. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest. Max was growling fiercely by his side, his body tense with the threat of danger. He looked around. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Move, Captain Harris shouted, pushing Jake toward the back of the room, trying to create some distance between them and the attackers. The fight was chaotic. Gunfire rang out, loud and deafening. Jake ducked behind a crate, his breath coming fast as the sound of battle raged around him. Max was at his side, protecting him with a low, fierce growl. The world around him blurred, the flashing lights of gunfire making everything feel unreal. He couldn't focus on anything except surviving. He heard Captain Harris's voice above the chaos, sharp and commanding. Get the files. Now! Jake's eyes snapped to the far side of the room. There, amidst the mayhem, he saw it. One of the attackers holding a briefcase. The briefcase Isabella had risked everything for. The briefcase that held the answers to everything. Without thinking, Jake sprinted toward the man, his heart racing. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He had to stop them from getting away with this. He tackled the man to the ground, the briefcase falling from his hands. Jake grabbed it, holding it tight against his chest, as gunfire erupted all around him. The man he had knocked down reached for his weapon, but Jake was faster, slamming the butt of the briefcase into the man's face, knocking him out cold. Captain Harris appeared at his side, her gun raised as she cleared the path ahead. Let's go, she shouted, her voice urgent. We can't stay here. Jake barely had time to react. He grabbed the briefcase, holding it tight as they moved toward the back exit. More enemies closed in on them, but the team fought their way through, moving with a precision that Jake had never seen before. The warehouse was on fire now, the smoke billowing through the air, the flames lighting up the night sky. It was chaos, but Jake wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the files, about the truth. They made it to the exit, their escape route in sight. But as they reached the door, a figure stepped into the doorway, blocking their path. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, but Jake could tell who it was. The same man who had revealed everything to them. The one who had betrayed Isabella. He stepped forward, his cold eyes locking onto Jake's. You really think you've won, don't you? He said, his voice low and filled with menace. Jake's grip on the briefcase tightened. This ends now, he said, his voice steady despite the fear swirling inside him. The man smiled. You don't know what you're up against. As the door slammed shut behind them, Jake realized one undeniable truth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The figure standing before them was like a shadow, blocking their only way out. Jake's hands trembled as he clutched the briefcase to his chest. The air around him was thick with the acrid scent of smoke from the warehouse fire, and the sounds of distant sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of more danger. Move aside, Captain Harris demanded, her voice firm as she aimed her weapon at the man blocking their path. You don't want to do this. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a small, almost pitying smile. You really think you can stop this? You can't. Not when you don't even understand the bigger picture. Jake's mind was a blur of thoughts. What bigger picture? He had been caught in this whirlwind of danger and betrayal, and he was no closer to understanding who these people were or why they wanted the files so badly. But he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let them win. The man stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving Jake's. Isabella's death was just the beginning. And now you're part of it, Jake. There's no escaping it. Captain Harris moved faster than Jake could follow, firing her weapon at the man. But he dodged, quick and calculated, like he'd been trained for this moment. He was good. Too good. Jake's body froze as he watched the fight unfold. Captain Harris was engaged in a deadly standoff with the man, but the attackers were closing in fast. There was no way out. I said move! Captain Harris shouted, taking another shot that grazed the man's shoulder. The man didn't react to the shot. He stood there, unbothered, almost amused. You still don't get it. You're not the ones in control. You never were. Jake's chest tightened. This wasn't just a fight, it was a trap. He had been led here, manipulated by forces far more powerful than he could understand. But there was something else. Something that Isabella had left him. Something he could feel in his bones. The briefcase. The information. He had to make sure it got out. As the final battle raged on, Jake's thoughts finally cleared. The files weren't just the key to their survival, they were the key to stopping everything. They held the answers to a larger conspiracy, and Isabella had died trying to protect them. With a final, desperate rush of energy, Jake darted toward the man, tackling him to the ground. His body collided with the attacker, and for a split second, the room was silent. Jake grabbed the man by the throat, desperation filling every fiber of his being. Tell me what this is all about. Jake shouted, his voice raw with emotion. The man's eyes flickered with something, recognition maybe, and then he smiled one last time. You really don't know, do you? In that moment, everything went still. Jake's eyes widened as the man's lips formed the words. The truth? It's already too late. Thank you to my amazing family for staying with me until the end of this story. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed this journey, I just know you'll love what comes next. I've prepared something even more exciting and surprising that I can't wait to share with you. Just click on the end card appearing on your screen right now to watch the next one.